The world we live in is beautiful and mysterious. Sometimes people see things, or something that is beyond understanding and reality. For others, it is a fantasy that is impossible to believe. Usually, such people are considered crazy and are simply locked up in a mental hospital. But what if this is not so? What if monsters really exist? Our next story is just about them. Well, let's get started. In the far north of Canada, among the endless icy expanses, there is a small town of Brooksville. This town seemed lost in the endless snow, surrounded by dense coniferous forests and majestic snow-capped mountains, whose peaks pierced the low gray sky. Brooksville had only a couple of hundred residents, and here everyone knew each other by sight and by name. People lived calmly, measuredly, warmed by friendliness and mutual care, which was simply necessary in such harsh conditions. Three middle-aged men, Michael, James, and Oliver, had been close friends since childhood. All three had wonderful families, whom they loved more than life itself. Their homes were warm, cozy, and smelled of freshly baked goods, and children's laughter and ringing voices filled the air. Every morning they went to work, knowing that after their shift they would return home to the arms of their loved ones. All three worked on the local railway. In fact, it was almost the only enterprise that worked and brought money into the city budget. They enjoyed deep respect. Their work was considered quite prestigious and highly paid. The men carried out a very important mission. They delivered groups of scientists and specialists to remote northern stations, where they spent shifts observing climate change, seismic activity, and studying weather anomalies. Such trips were always carefully planned, and the crew checked the locomotives and carriages more than once before setting off on a long journey. On this special winter day, the snow fell softly and thickly, covering the ground with a fluffy, snow-white carpet. Michael, James, and Oliver arrived at the railway station early in the morning, when the town had not yet woken up. Immersed in sleep and silence, the guys quickly and professionally carried out all the necessary checks. The locomotive hummed, warming up in the cold. The wheels creaked quietly in the frost, and the carriage was gradually filled with the necessary equipment and supplies for the expedition. As soon as the group of scientists took their seats, the train smoothly moved off. The railway ran through incredibly beautiful winter landscapes. On both sides of the tracks, endless white fields stretched out, shimmering silver in the pale light of the winter sun. Sometimes the train rushed past frozen rivers and lakes, covered in a thick crust of ice that sparkled in the rays of the sun. In the distance, silhouettes of coniferous trees could be seen, wrapped in fluffy snow, looking like huge snow giants, standing in silent anticipation. Sometimes, among the trees, one could see the silhouettes of moose or wolves, watching the train rushing past. As evening came, a huge full moon appeared in the sky, filling everything around with a soft silvery light. The snowfall intensified, the snowflakes became larger and denser, but the road was still clearly visible, and the train moved confidently forward. A little more than halfway through the journey, something changed suddenly, as the road began to curve around the steep mountain slopes. Suddenly, a dull, deep sound like distant thunder came from the mountains, breaking the silence of the night. The crew looked at each other in alarm, feeling an uneasy premonition. "What was that?" James asked, looking ahead through the snow-covered window of the locomotive. Suddenly, from around the bend, massive rock fragments appeared, rumbling and sliding down the slope, heading straight for the railway track. Michael's heart froze. He jerked the emergency brake lever sharply. The locomotive screeched shrilly. Sparks and hot particles of metal and snow flew from under the wheels. The train began to slow down. The single carriage shuddered and trembled. The frightened voices of the scientists were heard. But the brakes were too late. Huge boulders fell right in front of the locomotive with a deafening roar and grinding sound, blocking the track and forcing the train to stop just a few meters from the rubble. An uneasy silence reigned around again. Only the snow slowly swirled in the light of the full moon, settling on the roof of the locomotive and the carriage. The men and scientists looked at each other, realizing that they were about to meet the unknown in the very heart of the wild and cold nature. Everyone in the carriage was stunned and gradually began to panic. Anxious whispers grew into loud, frightened questions. James was the first to open the door, and a cold gust of wind rushed inside the carriage, making everyone shudder. The men carefully climbed down onto the snow, illuminated by the flickering light of the moon, and began to examine the rubble. The collapse looked terrifying. Giant boulders covered in a thick layer of snow completely blocked the railway track. Some of the stones were so large that it became clear that it was impossible to remove them manually. The scientists began to fussily exit the carriage one after another, trying to understand what had happened, asking numerous questions and getting in each other's way underfoot. "Everyone get back into the carriage. It could be dangerous here," Oliver shouted loudly, holding a lantern in one hand and pointing at the carriage with the other, trying to restore order among the worried people. Michael and James supported their friend, directing people back inside. The storm was getting stronger. Gusts of wind hit their faces, burning their skin with ice chips. Finally, making sure that everyone was back in the carriage, the men went into the locomotive, where they quickly contacted the dispatcher. "We have a problem," Michael reported over the radio. "The tracks are blocked by a serious collapse. We can't go back, and the storm is getting worse. What do you advise?" "Over. We are awaiting further instructions." While the railway workers were waiting for an answer, scientists kept looking into the cabin, asking nervously and annoyingly, "What's going on? How long are we stuck here? What's next? Are we going to go back or what? Can you give us at least some kind of clear answer?" These repetitive questions really irritated the men, because they themselves did not yet know what to do. "We ask you to calm down and be patient. We are awaiting an answer from the dispatcher. As soon as something is clear, we will let you know," Michael answered nervously. Finally, the dispatcher's voice came over the radio. "Guys, you have two options. The first is to wait until the morning, until the rescuers get to you and try to clear the rubble. The second is to go back 20 miles. There is an old spare line that also leads to the station. Only," the dispatcher's voice hesitated, "this line has not been used for about 60 years. Its condition is unknown." The railroad workers exchanged glances. James remembered how one old worker in a local bar told strange stories about this abandoned road, mentioning some monsters that he allegedly saw there. At that time, his stories were perceived only as drunken chatter. "The decision is yours," the dispatcher added. Michael took out old maps and soon found a diagram of the abandoned line. After consulting with each other and the scientists, the men decided to take a risk and go along the old road. The train slowly moved back. James stood on the back of the train, holding a huge lantern, looking into the snow, trying not to miss the turn. The snow was blinding his eyes. The cold was piercing through him, making James shudder with every gust of wind. Finally, noticing the barely discernible outline of the abandoned track, James desperately waved the lantern and shouted Meetoid, "Stop! The turn is here. Slow down." The locomotive braked sharply, its wheels grinding on the frozen rails. James, shaking from the cold, ran inside. The men exchanged tense glances, in which uncertainty and fear of the unknown were visible, but they had to move forward. There were other people at the station waiting for them. They were almost out of food supplies, and leaving them there for a couple more days was not an option. So the only thing left to do was move forward. "Well, gentlemen, with God," Oliver said quietly, directing the train onto the old, long-forgotten road, not even suspecting what was waiting for them ahead. The locomotive moved forward slowly and very carefully along the old forgotten road. The grinding of the wheels on the rusty rails seemed especially loud in the surrounding silence. Gradually the storm began to subside, and the men felt a slight relief. All the passengers, having calmed down, looked out of the windows with curiosity and caution, examining the beautiful, unfamiliar area like little children. Along the road towered huge, like ancient guardians, spruce trees, covered with a thick layer of snow. The branches, heavily bent under the snow mass, hung almost to the ground, sometimes touching the train cars, as if wanting to look inside. Rocky cliffs rose to the right and left, cut by deep gorges and canyons. Sometimes the road ran through wide, flat areas, covered with a snow-white blanket, which looked untouched and perfectly smooth under the cold light of the moon. At times the moon hid behind dark clouds, and the train found itself in complete darkness. At such moments the passengers became quiet, and the atmosphere became especially eerie and tense. Narrow winding turns, surrounded by thick darkness and massive stone walls, caused a feeling of inexplicable anxiety in people. Suddenly, when the train slowly entered another dark section of the road, Michael, peering carefully through the window of the locomotive, noticed a strange movement. Several flashes of snow, as if something huge was plunging under the snow cover at incredible speed. Michael shuddered and abruptly recoiled from the window, hitting his back against the opposite wall. "What is it, Mike? Did you see something?" James asked anxiously, noticing his friend's pale face. "I don't know. I must have imagined it." Michael tried to calm himself and his friends, but there was worry in his voice. Oliver shook his head doubtfully. "Maybe it's just fatigue, Mike. It's just that we're all a little nervous now." But before the men could calm down, the door to the cabin suddenly opened and the scientists rushed in, scared and pale. "Did you see that?" they shouted, interrupting each other. "Something huge just dived into the snow." "We noticed something similar, but it could have just been branches or a trick of the shadows," James said firmly, trying to calm everyone down. "Please get back in the carriage," Michael added. "You are interfering with our control of the locomotive. Everything is under control. There is no reason to worry." The scientists reluctantly left the cabin, whispering quietly and casting anxious glances at the windows. As soon as the door closed behind them, the men looked at each other, fear clearly visible in their eyes. "What the hell is going on here?" Oliver whispered. No one had time to answer, because the train suddenly and very sharply braked, as if someone pulled the emergency brake. The wheels squealed, sparks flew from under them. The men miraculously stayed on their feet, grabbing the handrails and the walls of the cabin. "Who pulled the emergency brake?" James shouted. "No one," Michael responded, checking the controls. "Everything was fine. I didn't touch anything." Before they could figure out the situation, the power suddenly went out. The cabin was plunged into complete darkness, and only the weak light of the moon penetrated through the windows. Panic began in the carriage. Anxious voices and screams were heard. "What now?" Oliver barely audibly whispered, feeling the fear growing. The men stood in the dark cabin of the locomotive, surrounded by silent, hostile nature, not knowing what awaited them next. The drivers again tried to contact the dispatcher on the radio, but the only answer was ominous silence and the hiss of interference. Checking cell phones also brought no results. There was no signal. Michael nervously fingered the cables and checked the control panels, but the locomotive remained completely lifeless. James, meanwhile, examined the insides of the generator, trying to find at least some kind of malfunction, but nothing helped. "It's all useless," James said tiredly, wiping his hands on his clothes. "We need to decide what to do next," Oliver said firmly, and the men decided to go into the carriage to the others. An uneasy silence reigned in the carriage. The scientists looked with concern at the men who entered, waiting for at least some information. "Please have a minute's attention. Please do not panic. We have no communication," Michael said gloomily. "The locomotive is completely de-energized. We need to decide what to do next." Everyone began to vigorously discuss possible options, when suddenly strange sounds were heard from outside. Something heavy and massive seemed to be pushing apart the stone gorge, trying to break through to the outside. At first the sound came from one side, but soon it began to be heard from all sides, as if surrounding the carriage and the locomotive. Fear and panic instantly seized everyone in the carriage. People began to listen to these eerie, inexplicable sounds that did not resemble anything from the world they knew, neither a person nor an animal, but something in between, hoarse, rough, and ominous. Some members of the expedition looked out the windows in horror. Others hid under the seats, pressing themselves to the floor, and someone froze near the wall of the carriage, afraid to move. The sounds became closer and more insistent. Suddenly, the carriage jerked sharply, as if jumping on the spot, swaying violently from side to side. People screamed in horror, clinging to the handrails and to each other. "Calm down, we need to stay calm," James shouted, trying to shout over the panic. But again there was a powerful jolt, reminiscent of an earthquake, accompanied by a new burst of screams and panic. The sound outside became even closer and more disgusting, causing icy goosebumps on the skin. Suddenly, one of the scientists noticed a strange sound coming from his suitcase. He quickly opened it and was surprised to find that the new device for measuring seismic activity was turned on. The device showed amazing data. The magnitude of the tremors reached 8.2 points. "This is impossible," muttered the scientist, looking at the device in complete confusion. "Maybe it's just an earthquake?" one of the passengers asked hopefully. "But where did these sounds come from then? An earthquake cannot be so short and periodic," objected the other. Everyone began to ask the scientist questions, but before they could get answers, one of the carriage windows suddenly shattered with a clang, and a huge frightening hand with long clawed fingers stuck inside. The monster instantly grabbed the seismograph that the scientist was holding and began to pull it out. The scientist screamed in horror and pain, clutching the device tightly. Other passengers rushed to him, trying to tear their colleague from the monster's tenacious fingers. But the hand was incredibly strong, and people were unable to do anything. Absolute chaos reigned in the carriage. Panic and horror completely captured everyone inside. The scientist's scream died away in the darkness, leaving behind only a thin echo that disappeared after a few seconds. A terrifying silence hung in the carriage, broken only by the ragged breathing and muffled sobs of people. Someone screamed in panic, "We need to get out of here. If we stay here, we'll all die." Others were completely paralyzed with fear, unable to move. James, trying to maintain at least some calm, raised his voice. "Quiet. Everyone, please go to the corner of the carriage and turn off all the lights. Maybe this creature reacts to light or sound." The people obeyed without further ado, and crowded into one of the corners of the carriage, trying not to make any noise. In the dark, tense silence, possible courses of action were discussed in whispers, but no one could offer anything sensible. Finally, Michael decided, "I'll go out and see what's going on there. We need to at least understand what we're dealing with. Maybe we shouldn't? Oliver whispered quickly, looking at his friend with concern. Yes, Mike, don't. It's too risky, one of the scientists said in a strangled voice. I'll be careful, Michael answered quietly, although his voice was trembling. There's no other way. Everyone watched in silence as Michael, struggling to contain his fear, slowly opened the carriage door. The cool air outside was filled with absolute silence and anxious tension. The moon's light, almost ghostly glow, dimly illuminated the surroundings. Everyone else peered out from behind the door, afraid to breathe or move. Michael took a few cautious steps through the snow, looking around carefully. At first he didn't notice anything unusual, but then as he came closer, from the side where the window was broken, his heart skipped a beat. Enormous footprints were clearly visible in the snow, similar to human ones, only much larger. They went somewhere to the side, dissolving in the darkness. An anxious whisper came from the carriage. Michael, do you see something? Have you found something? He slowly turned to the carriage, about to answer, when suddenly his whole body tensed with horror. Just a moment, and something huge, fast and silent, emerged from the darkness, exploding the thick snow cover, and grabbed Michael with incredible force. No! Help! Michael screamed desperately, trying to break free from the monster's grip. The people from the carriage rushed forward, but fear and indecision paralyzed them, forcing them to freeze in place. Michael desperately struggled, trying to free himself, but the creature easily lifted him off the ground like a rag doll. His screams gradually died down, dissolving into the darkness of the night. The carriage was once again filled with icy horror and panic. People realized that they had encountered something much more terrible than they could have imagined. Amidst the wild horror and panic, thanks to the weak glow of the moon, the people remaining in the carriage were able to clearly see the creature standing in front of them for the first time. Their breath caught, their hearts froze in horror. It was Mork. It towered 4 meters above the ground, a huge inhuman creature with incredibly massive feet that sank deep into the snow. Its long arms almost reached the ground. Its fingers were thin, bony, ending in terrible sharp claws that seemed capable of tearing apart anything that got in its way. Its body, vaguely resembling a human, was covered in pale bluish skin, through which black veins showed through, like canals filled with inky blood. Bones bulged under the thin skin, as if the creature were constantly hungry and exhausted. Along its curved spine, razor-sharp spikes jutted out chaotically in different directions and trembled slightly as it moved. The giant head was elongated and terrible, reminiscent of a wolf's muzzle with deep, longitudinal scars, as if left by the claws of an even more terrible creature. The eyes shimmered with a cold, inhuman light, and the huge, terrifying jaw slowly opened and closed, revealing rows of sharp teeth. Behind the creature was a long tail, about 3 meters long, forking in the middle into tentacle-like appendages, writhing in the air and seeming to have a life of their own. Everyone watched in horror as this creature easily tore off Michael's skin and entrails, as if peeling a banana and shaking off the remains of the stuck flesh to its hands like breadcrumbs. In the terrible paws covered in black blood, only the skull and spine with scraps of bone remained. The monster shook the entrails into the snow and stuffed the bones into its mouth, slowly and with pleasure chewing, making a disgusting crunching sound. Seeing this, the 4 scientists were overcome with uncontrollable horror. They began to run out of the carriage one after another. The young girl ran out first, rushed past the locomotive, and ran forward along the rails in hysterics. She stumbled, fell, but stood up again and looked back in despair. At one of these moments, the monster, moving lightning fast, appeared right in front of her. The girl screamed so loudly that her scream seemed like a desperate cry from the entire universe. The monster, irritated by the noise, roughly grabbed her body and slammed her several times against the rock nearby. The girl's skull was instantly crushed. The creature tore off all her flesh with one gesture, threw away her entrails, and swallowed her bones. The three remaining members of the expedition, hearing the scream of their colleague, ran back along the tracks, hoping that her death had distracted the monster and they had a chance to escape. But they had barely covered a few meters when the ground shook under their feet, and two more of the same monsters appeared in front of them. The morgue surrounded the people, blocking their path. Viscous gray saliva flowed from their mouths. Their tongues were long and writhing, as if anticipating fresh prey. The scientists stopped in horror, fell, tried to get up, but it was too late. The long tentacle tails of the monsters instantly pierced their bodies, lifting them high above the ground. The fate of the unfortunate was decided. Life left their bodies in an instant, just as horribly and mercilessly as the previous victims. A moment later, everything was dead silent again. The two remaining drivers, James and Oliver, huddled together in the corner of the locomotive, barely breathing. The bloody remains of people who had recently been alive and full of hope were scattered around the carriage. There were only two of them left, and they understood that their chances of salvation were practically zero. James and Oliver sat in the corner of the locomotive, huddled close to each other, trembling so much that their bodies shook with fear. Cold sweat covered their faces, and their hearts beat wildly in their chests, echoing with pain in their temples. The blood literally froze in their veins from the realization that their death was inevitable. "What should we do, James?" Oliver whispered, barely audibly, his voice trembling more than his body. "I don't know," James whispered, clenching his fist so hard that his nails dug into his palms, cutting through his skin until it bled. "This can't be happening. Is this really happening to us? I don't understand what this is. What should we do next? After all, what do these creatures react to? Movement, sound, heat. Anything can give us away." Oliver nodded nervously, looking around as if expecting the monsters to burst in right now. "Listen, I have an idea," James suddenly muttered, trying to sound confident, although his voice was betrayingly breaking. "We're standing on a slight incline. If we disconnect the carriage, it will roll down the tracks. We could hide underneath it and try to distance ourselves from these monstrous creatures." Oliver immediately assessed the proposal. "Do you think this will work?" "We have no other options. It's either this way or nothing," James answered decisively. Both drivers carefully exited the cab, trying to move as quietly as possible, barely breathing. There was a frightening dead silence all around, broken only by the quiet creaking of the snow underfoot. Oliver was the first to carefully crawl under the carriage, and James looked anxiously into the darkness, trying to make sure that Carrot wasn't nearby, and grabbed the coupling lever tightly. Straining his whole body, he pulled it toward himself with all his strength. There was a characteristic metallic click. The carriage began to slowly roll down the slope, accompanied by a piercing, ear-splitting screech of wheels on old rusty rails. But James had barely managed to take a step back and try to crawl under the carriage when the night silence was again torn apart by a terrifying, space-rattling sound. A deep, low roar, as if the earth itself had opened its mouth, releasing a nightmare. James screamed, "Hold on, Oliver! They're coming!" The next moment, one of the monsters appeared from the darkness, as if it had materialized out of thin air. It placed a massive paw under the carriage, abruptly stopping it. The sudden jolt threw James to the side. He hit his head painfully on a protruding stone and fell into the snow, stunned and disoriented. The monsters, as if sensing the thrill of the hunt, furiously grabbed the carriage, tearing its metal body as if it were ordinary paper. One of them lifted a part of the carriage, and Oliver was underneath, desperately clinging to the remains of the bottom. The monster contemptuously threw the unnecessary piece of metal far into the darkness, and easily picking up the man in a bony hand, passed him to another. With unbearable cruelty, they tore off all living things from him, as if removing a glove, released his entrails outside, and crunched his bones with pleasure. James, coming to his senses, clutched his bloody head. In a panic, he stumbled back to the locomotive. The monsters immediately noticed his movement. Having barely reached the cabin and slammed the door behind him, James fell to the floor, gasping for breath from horror and despair. The Morks slowly surrounded the locomotive, crouched down on different sides, and began to lightly and cynically push it from side to side with their fingers. Their movements were leisurely, almost playful, like a cat playing with a mouse before devouring it. James understood that this was the end. Images of his family, his wife and children, whom he would never see again, flashed through his mind. His heart sank with unbearable pain and longing. It is difficult to even imagine what a person feels when his minutes are almost numbered and he knows that only a painful and terrible death lies ahead. In desperation, he grabbed a piece of paper lying nearby and scribbled a short message with trembling fingers. For those who might find him later, "Run quickly, they—" He did not have time to finish. The huge claws of the monsters pierced the roof of the cabin, tearing the metal like a paper napkin. Tentacle-like tails descended inside and grabbed James with unbearable force, lifting him up. He screamed desperately, feeling how sharp pain pierced his entire body. The monsters were in no hurry. They slowly and painfully pulled the skin off James, starting from his legs and moving higher. The man's scream spread through the night emptiness, filled with inexpressible pain and despair, but soon it died down, giving way to a terrifying silence. The last thing James saw before his death were these monstrous eyes, burning with cold malice, slowly plunging into bloody darkness. Dawn came. The first rays of the sun broke through the sparse clouds, filling the gorge with a soft golden light. It seemed that nature was completely indifferent to the horrors that had happened during the night. Among the blindingly white snow, sparkling in the sun, scarlet spots of blood stood out in terrible contrast. The remains of bodies were scattered everywhere, disfigured and torn pieces of flesh beyond recognition. In the middle of this terrible sight stood a mangled locomotive, turned from the inside by giant hands, like a simple candy wrapper. At this time, the town of Brooksville was slowly waking up. Only the dispatcher, who had been on duty at the station all night, did not close his eyes. All night he unsuccessfully tried to contact the locomotive, hoping that the problem was simply a bad connection or the weather. But at exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, his hopes were cruelly destroyed by a phone call. Scientists from the station were calling, asking why they had not yet been relieved. The dispatcher felt an icy fear grip his body. He realized that something terrible and irreversible had happened. Services were immediately raised on alert, organizing an urgent rescue operation. Only there was no one left to save. Soon a helicopter was called to evacuate the scientists, who were left at the station without supplies. But the hardest task was to inform the families of the engineers about the disappearance of their husbands. The relatives were in a state of shock, refusing to believe what had happened. The news of the tragedy instantly spread throughout the city, causing fear and grief among the residents. And only one old man, who had long been considered insane and crazy from drinking, wandered the streets and grimly muttered under his breath, I told them, I told everyone. There is evil there. It is older than all of us, and it does not like uninvited guests. The rescuers went to the place where, according to assumptions, the train turned onto an abandoned branch. When they got there, the terrible picture made them freeze in horror. Torn, bloody parts of flesh of bodies, entrails, remnants of clothing lay on the snow, mixed with twisted pieces of metal and scattered fragments of the car. The smell of blood and death hung in the air, causing nausea and dizziness. The two rescuers, struggling to overcome their numbness, approached the torn locomotive and cautiously peered inside. Among the chaos and destruction, they noticed a crumpled piece of paper on which the last words were crookedly written. "Run immediately, they—" "What nonsense!" one of the rescuers muttered nervously, looking at the note. "This is impossible. What even happened here?" His colleague was about to answer, but suddenly in the distance, a familiar low, vibrating sound was heard, as if something terrible was awakening from underground again. The rescuers slowly turned in the direction of the sound, and the blood froze in their veins with horror. In the depths of the gorge, among the shadows and semi-darkness, huge inhuman figures began to stir. Their long, bony arms stretched forward, and their eyes gleamed with cold, implacable malice. "Oh my God," the rescuer whispered, feeling fear paralyze his body. He couldn't move, couldn't even scream. The sounds of the creature's footsteps were getting closer, and at that moment the men realized that they couldn't run away. Despair overwhelmed them, making them realize the inevitability of a terrible and painful death. The policemen who were part of the rescue group took out their weapons and began shooting chaotically. They thought that the bullets would stop these monsters, or at least make them stop. But no, the Morks didn't even flinch. Not a single bullet was able to stop them. Their last thoughts were of their families, loved ones, and those they would never see again. And then the world plunged into darkness, filled only with the echo of wild screams, filled with pain and hopelessness, spreading over the silent, snowy expanses. The end. Don't forget that it's up to you whether this story gets a second life. The one that gets the most likes and views will find its continuation with an equally creepy and terrible development of events. Thank you for being with us.